So our new unit is going to be about the Middle Ages, and as you've probably guessed, Chaucer, so Geoffrey Chaucer, and the Canterbury Tales, the major work we're going to be reading. Now, the Middle Ages, as you see here, is definitely not a time period you guys would want to live in. It's amusing looking back and looking at all the hardship they went through and how crappy it was, but you definitely wouldn't have wanted to be there. As you may remember from our last unit, talking about the Anglo-Saxon era, that kind of ended with the Norman conquest when William the Conqueror came in. Okay, so there are a lot of changes that are about to take place in England. So French does not become either the official or unofficial language of England, but it is something that they are all speaking. Okay, William the Conqueror, right, was not going to combine the lands of Normandy and England together. And he had no wish to replace the language or the culture. He was willing to let England be England during this time period. So Latin and English, of course, are going to be used for most of the documents and formal proclamations that William's going to issue. And the English legal system is going to be renewed, but not replaced. Again, he's not trying to go in and stir things up. That's not what he's there for. However, the upper class, of course, is going to be completely taken over by the French-speaking Normans. And although the system is English, many of those legal proceedings and documents are going to be in French. It's kind of like if you speak English, you want everyone else around you to speak English. You don't want to rule a country where you can't understand anybody. So, of course, he's going to bring in his French-speaking friends to kind of rule around him with him. So the law of the land during this time is going to be feudalism, and you've probably studied this in some of your history classes. You have this upper nobility class that's going to maintain control over the lower classes, kind of like a pyramid style, and we'll show you a picture of that in a bit. It's basically a rigid structure of government that's going to consist of kings at the top, then you have your nobles or your barons, so that's what we're going to call them for this unit, or barons, and then of course you have your peasants, which we're going to refer to as serfs. So the leaders of the church and the neighboring nobles are going to hold a lot of sway, a lot of power in this kind of pyramid system. Okay, the king needs a way to maintain a lot of the land that he has, even if that means it's going to be indirect control. Okay, so it's kind of like if you guys have this entire school building to manage, okay, you want someone in each wing. Okay, so A, B, D, and F wing. So in order to do that, the king is going to have these barons, remember those are the nobles, that are going to be given a large portion of the king's land known as fiefs or manors. So in turn, those nobles or barons are going to pay homage and fealty to the king. They're going to respect him and give him some of the profits from the land. So that's like if we here at the high school, someone's leading, the principal, right, is going to give each wing is going to have a noble that's going to oversee that wing. Okay, so their wing is going to be their fief or their manor. Okay, so those barons are going to give support to the king at all times, no matter what he asks. They're going to govern the land for the king, and they're going to be ready to provide troops and fight for the king when the need arises. So if the king wants to go to war and you don't support it, sucks to suck, you got to do it anyway. So this is a picture of the pyramid I was kind of referencing earlier about feudalism. So you have your king at the top, who's going to own all the land in the country, and they're the ones that are going to make the laws, and he's going to give an area of land called a fief to the rich lords and the nobles. That's kind of the next stage right there. In return, those lords and nobles are going to supply the king with soldiers and horses for his army. And those nobles gave some of their land to professional soldiers. So that's kind of the next layer right there in the pink. Okay, so in return, those knights are going to fight for the nobles and the king. All right, down at the bottom, you have your peasants or your serfs who are going to work the land for the nobles. And of course, the knights who in turn are going to offer them protection. So they get shelter, protection, and food, but they're going to farm the land and pay rent and everything to those knights. So one really important guy we're going to talk about in reference to our story is going to be St. Thomas à Becket. He was actually murdered in 1170 and assassinated by followers of King Henry in Canterbury Cathedral. So that's kind of where Chaucer gets the idea of the Canterbury Tales. So he was canonized as both a saint and a martyr following his murder. And so they built a shrine for him. And that shrine, the Shrine of St. Thomas à Becket, is going to be a popular destination for religious pilgrimages during the Middle Ages. Another event of note during this time period is the Black Death. And you guys have probably heard about this in your history classes as well. In 1348, that Black Plague is going to reach England and it's going to wipe out a third of the population. So that's like 2.25 million to 3.75 million people. And that's a big deal. So if you think about it in our classes, that leaves maybe about 6 students if we have like a class of 30 or so. right? That sudden collapse in the population, of course, is going to send prices skyrocketing because it's going to increase the price of labor and decrease the price of land. And the way that kind of works is if, say, there's 6 students working in a field, okay? And of course, of those 6, a third of them are wiped out. That only leaves a few left, right? So they don't want to do all that work without being paid extra or compensated for all the extra work they're having to pick up because their friends died, right? So of course they're going to demand more pay. So that's where you get the increase in the price of labor. So those nobles then aren't going to be able to afford some of their peasants, their serfs, right, that are working the land because the price is just too high. So the only way to get rid of that issue is to try and get rid of some of the land that they're having to work. So of course, everyone's offering land though. So in order to get rid of it, you have to sell it at a ridiculously low price. So that's why the price of land is going to decrease. So the overall effect of the plague is that it's going to hasten the collapse of feudalism. It's going to make it kind of fall apart, and because it's going to create a lot of competition for labor and tenants. So the next section of these notes is going to be all about Geoffrey Chaucer and his life and times. So over here on the left, you have a picture of him that's actually drawn into the text of the Canterbury Tales, the original. And then, of course, you have a painting over there on the right. So Geoffrey Chaucer was the son of a London vintner or winemaker. So he's kind of a merchant. So that merchant class, the working class. He actually served in the royal household as page to the second son of Edward III. And he actually later held a series of administrative posts under Edward and Richard II. So he's kind of right there by, the ear of the king. He was able to visit France and Italy on behalf of the crown during the 1360s and 70s. So a really big deal, kind of acting as a regent, therefore, or diplomat. Chaucer's career illustrates the economic, political, and social ferment in the late 14th century of England. He was able to land wealth and get it instead of having moneyed wealth or being born to wealth. He was able to make a living for himself. Because of all the journeys that he went on for the king, he became really well-traveled on those diplomatic missions. He was able to read English, Latin, Italian, and even French. So a lot of that stuff we'll see again when we read it in our textbooks. So when Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales, he actually began in 1386, and he planned on writing a total of 120 tales. Now, very aspirational, but he didn't quite make it. He only completed 22 tales and 2 fragments. Some books say, a full 24, because they're counting those 2 fragments as completed. So the pilgrimage that these people are going on, okay, this long religious journey, okay, is a framing device for the tales, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the tales have thematic unity. So thematic unity, if you break it down, thematic meaning theme, unity kind of coming together. All of the tales have common themes. Okay, so main points and lessons. The pilgrims are going to share stories to pass the time on their journey because it is a really long journey for them. And the stories describe the very different points of view and beliefs and the practices that the people of Chaucer's age had during that time. Chaucer kind of breaks down the people on the pilgrimage into 3 big estates. You had those who work, the peasants, the middle class. So that's like merchants, laborers, farmers, government officials, people like that. You have those who pray or are part of the clergy or the church. So priests, monks, nuns, friars, pardoner's, those kind. Of course, the lower part of the clergy. And then you have those who fight and those in the nobility. So knights, squires, mercenaries, princes, and dukes. So people of that nature. So all the characters in this story are going to go on a pilgrimage, and they actually began as exercises in penance or an attempt to earn forgiveness. So if you were of the Catholic religion, you would go before the Father and say, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Tell him your sins, and then he'd say, "All right, your penance is to do this." And so pilgrimages kind of became one of those ways to earn forgiveness. However, the roads back then, after the Romans pulled out, they weren't really maintained at all. Okay, so they were horrible. And thieves often hid and wait for lone travelers. So a lot of people had to travel in groups as pilgrims. Later on, of course, the travel is going to end up improving. But of course, getting to far off spots like Jerusalem and such is never going to be easy or safe. Because remember, we don't have vehicles, can't fly there. So they're walking or riding horses or riding in carriages. Okay, professional pilgrims, so pilgrims that made this kind of a job, right? They ended up returning with relics, badges, and pilgrim symbols, and also a lot of tall tales that were falsified. So a relic is like a religious item. So back then, if you've ever been to like a Catholic church, a really fancy cathedral, maybe in like New York or even DC area, a lot of times they'll have something like an item like kind of closed off to everybody, but you can kind of look at it in a case from afar. Some might be like a goblet that they claim to be like the Holy Grail, the goblet that Jesus drank out of at the Last Supper. Some might be like a piece of cloth of like Mary, the mother of Jesus, wore, or maybe even a piece of cloth that Jesus was wrapped in before his resurrection, or even a splinter of the cross. But of course, keeping up with that and not having that decompose over time is unrealistic. So a lot of these items are actually fake, and they're just trying to pass them off as real. So as we mentioned before, the Canterbury Tales has it's a big frame story. And what that means is it's a story that holds together several other stories. Usually characters in the frame story are going to tell stories of their own. So for example, each of the characters in the Canterbury Tales is going to tell their own story. And it's going to have a whole nother cast of characters in it that aren't on the actual journey with them. So the story overall, the Canterbury Tales, is the story of a group of pilgrims who are going to tell stories as they travel to Canterbury Cathedral to the shrine of St. Thomas à Becket. And each pilgrim's story stands alone as its own story, but it kind of fits within the overall story of the journey. So it's kind of like when you frame a puzzle. Okay, all the little pieces are the stories the pilgrims are telling, those 22 tales. Okay, but they're all joined together by the frame. When you put the puzzle in a frame after you put it together, the frame around it is the actual journey, the pilgrimage they're on as they're telling their story, those puzzle pieces. While we're reading this story, because there are so many characters, we have a lot of characterization going on. So the first one we're going to talk about is indirect characterization, and a lot of this should be review. So indirect characterization is when an author is going to tell what a character does, says, or looks like, or describes how other characters react to him or her. Then the reader has to use their own judgment to decide what that character is like. The easiest way I do this is I call it FASTO, right? The F is how the character feels, the A is their actions or appearance, the S is their speech, the T is their thoughts, and O is other people's reactions to the character. So down here at the bottom, what can you infer about the character? Bill straightened his starched suit and slicked back his hair. He nudged his toothbrush to line up parallel with his toothpaste before he looked at himself in the mirror, then smiled with satisfaction. So if we look at this passage, we see that Bill, of course, is going to straighten a starched suit. So he's ironed it, it looks pristine. He slicks back his hair, so it's styled. However, he nudges his toothbrush and lines it up parallel to his toothpaste, so it's side by side. Okay, and then looks at himself in the mirror and is satisfied. The fact that he's lining his things up just so perfectly kind of gives the reader the idea that Bill is probably OCD. Okay, so he has to have things super neat and orderly. Chaucer is going to use indirect characterization with his major characters because he's going to give you more information on those characters so that you can kind of develop your thoughts on them. So some of the ones down here below, the yeoman wore a coat and hood of green and peacock-feathered arrows bright and keen. We're talking about his appearance here, but the fact that he has arrows that are given peacock feathers doesn't mean they're necessarily going to fly the straightest. If you've ever looked at a peacock feather, they're very wispy, not direct, and you kind of want sharp feathers that stick together in order for the arrow to fly straight. The next one is her greatest oath was only by St. Loy. So we're talking about her speech here. Okay, and when you're talking about a saint, it's kind of a religious thing, and so you're not supposed to kind of use that in vain. So we have here an issue. All right, the last example here, and gladly he would learn and gladly teach, is talking about the attitude, behavior, and feelings of the character. So we know that this is a learned person who likes to learn things and likes to teach other people things. And we can tell all of that basically by the few words, the indirect characterization that Chaucer gives us. Now, the other type of characterization is going to be direct characterization. And as its name implies, it occurs when the author states directly what a character's traits are. So if he says, you know, this person was vain, that person's vain. If they say they're smart or clever, that's what they are. If they're virtuous, that's what they are. So if we talk about Bill was vain and self-centered, if we're looking for what characterization traits they have, it's vain and self-centered. Okay. Chaucer is going to use direct characterization on minor characters, right? There was a friar, a wanton one, and Mary, a limiter, a very festive fellow. So we know directly what this character is like without having to read a whole bunch of stuff. Because they're minor characters, we don't want to waste a lot of time. So he's just going to give it to you directly. Another concept we're going to talk about when reading the Canterbury Tales is irony. And irony is an incongruity between what might be expected and what actually occurs. So that basically means that what we expect to happen doesn't necessarily always occur the way we would expect it to. Coincidence is something we kind of often confuse for irony. They're really similar, but they're not the same. The one thing we're going to see the most is verbal irony. So this is when a contrast between what is said and what is actually meant. So the surface meaning and the underlying meaning of what is said is not the same. It's kind of like if I had a look on my face and said, well, guys, I can definitely tell you studied for this test. And just based on the tone that I say, you can kind of imply that you probably all didn't study for your test and therefore you probably did pretty horrible. But I know you guys better than that. With verbal irony, we're also going to kind of talk about satire a little bit. Chaucer is going to provide a lot of details that contradict what the characters think of themselves. And it's a form of satire. So he's going to use witty language to kind of convey insult or scorn people. He's going to ridicule its subjects, so individuals, organizations, or even states. And it's usually meant so that he can provoke or prevent some kind of change from happening. We'll see this a lot with the church officials that we see within the pilgrimage. So a lot of you guys are probably asking, why the heck are we studying the Canterbury Tales? This looks long. This looks boring. But there's actually a lot of reasons why we do look at this text when we're studying British literature. For first off, it's an accurate depiction of what life was actually like in the Middle Ages. We get class levels, how they interacted between those classes. And it's also the first story about lower classes. We're mixing those kind of things together. Typically, you only hear about the nobility because they're the only ones that can really read or write. But because Chaucer built himself up from nothing, he gets to talk about where he came from, that merchant class. He also uses satire and humor for social, political, and religious commentary. He's letting you know exactly what he feels about these corrupt organizations, these corrupt individuals during his time period. And that's kind of a scary but intense thing to read about. And also, the Canterbury Tales is going to point out problems within its society because of all the satire and humor that Chaucer is using. So while we're reading the Canterbury Tales, we're going to learn a lot about the Pilgrims. We're going to talk about their social rank, their moral and spiritual condition. Okay, we're going to talk about their physical features, their clothes, their jobs, their hobbies, their choices of food, their humor, and even study how they talk and how they interact with other people. And it's going to give us a really big window into what life was like during the Middle Ages. Because, of course, you have just so much going on. Overall, the Canterbury Tales, a lot of them are going to be serious, but some of them are going to be funny. Okay, they're each going to be an accurate description of a set of traits, beliefs, and faults that are going to take place with these people during that time period. He's going to criticize the malpractice of the clergy, so those people in the church, and he's going to poke fun at those from the three estates. He's going to poke fun of the nobles, the clergy, and common people. Okay, a lot of the tales, again, are going to share similar themes, that thematic unity we talked about earlier. Some of them are going to be told in response to a previous story. Okay, so a story about the joy of immorality is going to be followed by a story about the punishment for sinners. So they're going to kind of bounce off of each other. And there's a reason Chaucer did this. He kind of wants it all to be tied together. He wants it to make sense as one big story and not just individual tales. But also let those tales kind of stand out on their own.